Hello, everyone. This is Cameron Smith from TechLogix here today to expand on our 20-minute webinar series, and we're specifically going to be looking at pre-wiring with fiber optic cable today. This is a relatively short webinar. Everybody who's online today is muted. If you do have any questions as we go through the content, I encourage you to use the little question section of your GoToWebinar widget. It usually pops up on the right-hand side of your screen. And I will get to those questions as we conclude here. Should be about 15 minutes worth of content, and then we'll have a little time for questions. So with that said, let's jump into the presentation today. So most people are talking about fiber optic cabling, right? This used to be something that only affected us if we were doing telecom or maybe high bandwidth datacom. But what we're seeing today is buildings, whether they're residential, whether they're commercial, they're being pre-wired with fiber. And there's a couple of different reasons for that. You know, we talk about bandwidth. We talk about resolution for video. We'll look at a couple of slides in a minute that really start to paint the picture of why this is very important. But it's really important for us as AV professionals and low voltage professionals to understand that fiber no longer stops at the outside of the building. You know, we're not just talking about the internet supplier or the internet provider coming in and bringing fiber to the Demarc and then, you know, the rest of the building's copper. That's not the case anymore. We're starting to see fiber being wired for networking, for AV. Obviously, you've got security and access control because some of the distances that are involved. But fiber is really a universal cable, and that's what surprises a lot of people. It can do everything that twisted pair can do with one exception. That's transmit power. And when I do these trainings and, you know, I teach a lot of the longer workshops, I always emphasize that. You got to think about how you're going to wire power into your designs. But when it comes to the actual signal distribution, whether it's audio, video, control, networking, fiber's really got you covered. And the other surprising thing about this is we've seen the fiber optic technology evolve quite a bit over the past recent years. It used to be that fiber was really expensive. And what surprises people is you can go out and buy duplex meaning 2 strands of fiber, for about 20 cents a foot, trade cost. So when we start to compare that to Cat 6, Cat 6A, Cat 7, Cat 8, we're seeing a cable that supplies infinitely more bandwidth, almost infinitely more bandwidth than copper. We'll talk about that here in a minute. Longer distances, a much better experience. So the chart on the screen, so we actually compare a Cat 8 cable, which maxes out at 48 gig or 40 gig, to a single mode fiber cable, which handles, you know, over 100 petagigs worth of data. It's a smaller cable, it's a stronger cable, it's a more pliable cable, and it's also a cable that's less expensive than most twisted pair. This is why a lot of professionals are starting to look at this and say, well, look, I can wire a building now. My customers can afford to do it. It's going to cut down on my labor costs. It's easier to work with these cables. It's a different environment today when we start looking at these optical cables versus 5 years ago, versus 10 years ago. It's a much better experience. Now, even though the experience has evolved, we still have to be cognizant of the fact that you have to do this. You have to look at these optical cables for a couple of different reasons. And a major reason is video bandwidth. It used to be when we were driving a 1080p signal or a 720p signal, you know, these are high definition signals. Cat 5 was fine. Cat 6 was fine. The magic number that we're dealing with here is about 10 gig. So as most people know, that's the top ceiling of a twisted pair cable, 10 gig. Now, a 1080p signal, that's clocking in around 4 gig. A 4K signal, depending on what we're doing with that 4K, we're either at about 9 to 10 gig, or if we're enabling HDR, a 444 color space, we're starting to push those resolutions up to 18 gig. So we start to have a problem with math. 18 gig video signal, 10 gig cable. That's an issue. Now, that's not to say we can't drive big bandwidth video signals over twisted pair. We can, but we've got to compress them. And a lot of the integrators that we work with, if we're working with a customer who's putting in a home theater, or they're spending a lot of money on that new high definition television, why are we compressing those signals when we can start to talk about an optical cable? Now, while it is possible to compress 18 gig down below 10 gig for twisted pair, you can't do it so easily with an 8K signal. An 8K is here. So we can go out, we can get 8K televisions, we can, we're starting to see 8K content. 8K content has actually been around for a long time. So anybody who watches sports, that, a lot of that native content is actually filmed in 8K. And then it's processed down to 1080p or maybe 4K for distribution, broadcast distribution. So we have content, we have displays. We're seeing the United States and also a lot of the international markets are being wired now with fiber to the business, right? The whole presentation that we're talking about today, we're talking about fiber to the business. So now we have a pipeline that can get this content from point A to point B. 8K is not handled with twisted pair, certainly not for video distribution. Network distribution, yes, you can packetize things, you can stream it. It takes a long time, it's slow, but native video content does not travel over that twisted pair cable. So as we're wiring up our homes, our businesses, churches, auditoriums, these places where we're talking about high definition content, we have to think about fiber because it is absolutely required for the bandwidth. But the reality is most applications out there, they're dealing with a network type application. Okay, we're dealing with streaming signals, whether that's the ISP bringing the service into the home or the business, or whether that's just the network that you're using to move traditional network traffic, or maybe teleconferencing, video conferencing, like what we're all doing today, watching videos online. A very important thing as we look forward over the coming weeks. We're tapping audio video distribution, we're tapping streaming distribution, and the reality is the vast majority of fiber, that's what it's being used for. We also have to talk about future proofing with an optical cable and for network distribution. So here on the screen, you start to see how fiber stacks up to those traditional twisted pair cables. Again, 10 gig for those top ceiling Cat 7 cables. Cat 8 over short distance will push up to 40 gig. Fiber, on the other hand, if we're talking with a multimode cable, we'll explain what multimode means here in a minute. If we're talking about a single mode cable, we're dealing with 100 petagigs worth of data. That's 10,000 times more bandwidth than what we see in these twisted pair cables. So we are future-proofing when we're putting in the optical cables. It's actually the electronics that are the weak link right now, because frankly, the electronics don't need 100 petagigs worth of data. We're not there quite yet in terms of need, but do know that the cable can handle that as we start to look into the future. Now, there's two different types of fiber that you're going to be pulling in the building, single mode and multi-mode. The nice thing is most of these cables are color coded. So if you see that yellow cable, that's a single mode cable. If you see an aqua cable, that's a multi-mode cable. Older multi-mode, you get into orange. Obviously, if you get into like direct burial, they get into black or gray or armored cables. But for the most part, the industry color codes these. The important thing is, what do you choose for your pre-wire? And I will tell you that there's not necessarily a right or wrong answer unless you're starting to talk about distance. Single mode's a cable we use for longer distances, and longer distances mean over 1,000 feet. Now, you can certainly use it for shorter distances. If you're wiring a Demarc, we'll look at that here in a minute, you have to use single mode, because think of what's coming into the building. That's a long distance application. You need a single mode cable. And what we're seeing is a lot of properties are just being wired up all single mode, short distance, long distance. That's what we're seeing, but you can obviously use multi-mode as well. It's a bigger cable made for shorter distances, but you get multiple modes of transmission, which are great for high bandwidth distribution at high speeds over short distance. Single mode actually supports more bandwidth, but they don't quite get into the multiple modes and the multiple speeds. Usually you're pulling two strands for a lot of the network distribution. But let's talk about that Demarc for a minute, because this is really important. And this is an area that people get into trouble really quickly, because what we'll see is they'll buy a multimode cable and just pull it out to the outdoor box on the outside of the building. It's not compatible with the cable that the ISP is bringing in. If you're wiring a box on the outside of the building that's going to be connected by your telecom provider, it's got to be a single mode cable. Anything before the modem, it's got to be a single mode cable. And one of the trends that we're seeing in audiovisual installations is the contractors picking where that box goes outside. So the building gets wired up prior to the telecom, the ISP coming in and bringing the connection. So they buy the box, they choose where it's going to be located. And that way you can make sure that, the Demarc box isn't necessarily next to the, the doorbell, or right next to the, front office window, or whatever it may be. You choose where that's going to be, but make sure that you're using single mode equipment. And I've got a couple of model numbers on this screen here so you can see what's a very typical installation, but it's all single mode product. Now, one of the biggest cables that we're seeing for these Prewires is what we call our ECOFiber line, okay? This is a product line that's specifically designed to be kind of an all-in-one cable as much as possible, right? So it's a cable that's waterproof. It's a cable that's plenum rated, a cable that has 2 strands of fiber, meaning you can use it for AV, networking, control distribution, really agnostic. Now, it does have a black jacket. So this particular model, the biggest seller that we're seeing, it's a single mode cable, because now I can use it for that Demarc wire. I can also use it for, in-building traditional AV distribution. And the way that it's jacketed up, that black jacket, it lends itself really well to that AV installation, where I'm doing a church and I don't want to see a yellow cable or an aqua cable strung across the ceiling. Great, it blends into the background. Or I'm wiring a rack and I don't want to see a lot of color in my rack. Great, it lends itself to that as well. And because it's what we would call a distribution cable, it's small, it's really strong. I mean, over 100-pound pull rating, very pliable. You can wrap it around your finger, it's not going to break. Terminate it quickly, compatible with all the standard tools and connectors out there. And it's 2 pieces of fiber in a single jacket, so it's really small. And it's easy to run. We're comparing it here to traditional zip cord fiber, and you can see how the size, it's actually about 50% smaller than a lot of traditional fiber that people are seeing. So this is one option. It's a big mover that's going into a lot of applications. Keep it in mind for some of the things that you're talking about. Now, connectors also play into this. The reality is most fiber is being pulled what we would call dark. So it's being pre-wired. And, the whole topic of what we're talking about today, pre-wire with fiber, is not even really being used yet. Or the building's getting wired up. A couple of main trunk lines are being used, maybe to connect some network switches, maybe for that, really high bandwidth, high resolution video distribution, but the rest of it's dark. We're not even putting connectors on it. But connectors, they are used. The big 2 that you're seeing in low voltage AV installations are LC connectors and SC connectors. The good news is both terminate in the same way, using the same tools, using the same process. It just so happens that the LC is the smaller one that goes into, more of the network applications, where SC is the larger style that goes into more of that Demarc wire, that telecom application. And while we're kind of limited on time in this particular training class today, 15, 20-minute training class, we have a lot of materials on this on the website. So you can search for different connectors. You can view articles that talk through the different applications and compare the size and the termination process through videos. We also have full online trainings that, they're industry accredited. They're about an hour long. They'll go into a lot more detail on how all of this works. I encourage you to hit the website or reach out to us for some of those materials. Let's talk about a couple more applications before we hit our time limit here. Video distribution. So we are seeing fiber pre-wired for video distribution. In this particular application, we're using multimode fiber, though single mode is an option. And the most important thing that I'd encourage people to take away from this slide is look at the boxes. So just about everybody's familiar with twisted pair extenders, right? HD-based T extenders, where we got a little black box that plugs directly into the fiber, and it's got ports for your HDMI or your video or your audio or your control. Well, we make those for fiber as well. So it's really the same installation process. Put your little black box at the display, put your other black box at the source, run your fiber between the two, and now you've got a long cable distribution that literally can be as short as 1,000 feet. You know, I say that short as 1,000 feet, that's kind of the short distance for fiber, but as long as several miles. So fiber can really deliver these high definition signals over very, very long distance. But common application, we're seeing video being run over fiber, and things like USB as well. So when we get into the commercial application with the cameras, you know, USB super speed cameras, you get into USB over fiber. I will tell you that when the fiber is being used, it's not being left dark. Most of the time, what's being connected to it, though, they're RJ45 devices. They're security cameras. They're access points. They're gate relays. There's all of these devices that are what we would call, you know, traditional network devices that don't have fiber ports, that have RJ45 ports. This is where media converters will become your best friend. So media converters, they're not expensive. I mean, we're talking like a $65 little black box that's going to convert your fiber connection to an RJ45 connection. And this allows you to integrate those different, you know, legacy devices, or even, let's face it, most of the new devices you buy, they're still going to be RJ45 based. And that media converter allows you to integrate those into that fiber optic run. And the advantages of this is you can pre-wire with fiber. You can run that cable to truly future-proof, but still use it today for the devices that are in the business, in the home. You can take advantage of some of the immunity properties of fiber, things like, you know, immunity to lightning, RF interference, electromagnetic interference, static electricity. Still use that fiber, you know, those immunity properties, but connect those legacy devices. So as we really start to put this all together, why do we look at fiber for a pre-wire? Well, it's smaller, it's stronger, it's much more pliable than twisted pair cable, you know, and it's easy to pull, easy to install. You will terminate this in anywhere from a minute to 2 minutes. There's a lot of good videos online that'll walk you through this process. You can buy cables that, you know, a single cable that can go inside, outside, put it underwater. It's waterproof. You can use it in the wall. You can, you know, run it everywhere. It's plenum rated. Does everything single cable that's going to work for all of these different applications. You get into the longer distances. Ironically, you know, and surprisingly, I should say, for most people, it's a cable that's lower cost, less expensive than most twisted pair cables, especially the shielded ones that are used for, you know, high bandwidth applications or sensitive video applications. But more importantly, you're future proofing, and you're using it today when you start to incorporate, you know, some of these $65 media converters into your applications. So there's a lot of reasons that we look at fiber, and there's a lot of reasons that this is really starting to explode in these pre-wired applications. So with that, we're hitting the 20-minute mark. Again, short little bite-sized bit of information on why we look at fiber in these pre-wire applications. I encourage everybody to go to the website, learn more. You can read articles, you can watch videos, you can take online courses, much longer courses that get you into more information on this topic. Feel free to reach out to me directly as well. My email and phone number are on the screen. I don't see many questions coming in. We do have one about whether this presentation will be available for download, and the answer is yes, actually. This is being recorded. Everybody who attended today will get a link, and we're even happy to share the slides. So if you want this content to go, feel free to just ping me or respond to the email that goes out. We'll make sure you get as much information as you need. With that, thank you for your time today. Appreciate everybody getting on early and visiting us. And feel free to reach out with any other questions as they come up. Take care.